It was December 2022 when my girlfriend Charlotte and I decided to take a winter getaway to the Pocono Mountains. We had rented a cozy Airbnb that was fully decked out with Christmas decorations. It promised a serene escape, complete with a breathtaking view, a spacious deck, and even a hot tub. A perfect retreat for the holiday season. To add to the charm, a blizzard was forecast for the evening, so we left the city early to settle in before the snow arrived. The drive was smooth, and after a quick stop at a Family Dollar to stock up on snacks and groceries, we finally arrived. The property was just as picturesque as it had appeared in the listing. Surrounded by dense woods, it had a warm, inviting glow from the Christmas lights strung across the house. There were illuminated reindeer, a large snowman, and candy cane decorations lining the walkway to the front door. Everything felt like a winter wonderland. Inside, the place exuded coziness. A Christmas tree stood proudly in one corner, stockings hung on the walls, and the faint smell of wood lingered in the air. After unpacking, we explored the house. There was a loft upstairs with a pool table and couches, and a dark, chilly basement that felt out of place compared to the rest of the home, more like a utility space than a part of the cozy retreat. As we were settling in, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man in his late 40s, wearing black sweatpants and a worn, yellowish-brown coat. He introduced himself as Tom, claiming he managed the property with his brother. He smiled and said if we needed anything, he lived just up the road. Something about the way he mentioned Charlotte, without having seen her, felt odd, but I brushed it off, assuming Mike, the Airbnb host, had mentioned us. The evening was idyllic at first. We cooked dinner, watched the Polar Express, and later decided to enjoy the hot tub on the deck. The snow was falling steadily, the Christmas lights twinkled, and everything felt magical, until the hot tub jets abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was unsettling. Then we heard it, footsteps crunching in the snow somewhere on the property. Charlotte and I exchanged nervous glances. She urged me not to call out, so we stayed quiet, listening as the steps grew fainter and eventually disappeared. I told her it was probably a deer, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. Afterward, we took a quick shower before bed, but the water turned ice cold within minutes. Frustrated, I messaged Mike about the issue and he assured me he'd send someone to fix the water heater the next day. Exhausted, we fell asleep, only to be jolted awake in the middle of the night by loud, aggressive banging on the front door. Charlotte clutched my arm, trembling. She begged me not to check, and honestly, I was too scared to argue. The pounding came in 3 distinct bursts, each one more forceful than the last, before stopping altogether. We sat in terrified silence, whispering to each other, until we eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I told Mike about the incident. He seemed genuinely baffled and suggested we call the authorities if anything else happened. As I went outside to clear snow off the car, I noticed fresh footprints circling the house. They were too recent to be from the previous night, given the steady snowfall. My heart sank. Just then, Tom appeared from around the corner of the house. He claimed he was there to check the water heater, which Mike had mentioned in our messages. Relieved to see someone handling the issue, I pointed out the footprints and mentioned the late-night knocking. Tom dismissed it casually, saying there were weirdos in the area but nothing to worry about. As he headed inside, something about his demeanor unsettled me. To ease my nerves, I messaged Mike, letting him know Tom was at the house. His reply froze me in my tracks. "Who's Tom?" Panic set in as I reread the message. Mike confirmed he had no brother named Tom and had not sent anyone to the property. My mind raced. Who was this man? What was he doing here? I rushed to Charlotte and told her to pack her things. We needed to leave immediately. Gathering our belongings as quietly as possible, we made our way to the car. Just as I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Tom approaching the vehicle, his pace quickening. Without hesitation, I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the snowy driveway and back onto the main road. Once we were a safe distance away, I called Mike and explained everything. He promised to contact the police and check the property himself. Later that evening, he called back, confirming that the police had found no one at the house. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the chilling fact that someone had been watching us the entire time. To this day, I can't shake the image of Tom's unsettling smile, or the thought of what might have happened if we had stayed even a moment longer. That Christmas getaway turned into a nightmare, one we'll never forget. It was early February 2023 when I decided to take a solo weekend trip to clear my mind. Work had been overwhelming, and I needed a break. I found an isolated Airbnb in the mountains, a small, rustic cabin surrounded by snow-covered trees. The listing mentioned it was perfect for solitude and relaxation, with a fireplace and large glass windows overlooking the forest. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The drive was long, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the frozen landscape. The cabin was charming, with a wraparound porch and a cozy vibe. Inside, it was warm and inviting, with a roaring fire already lit in the stone fireplace, as per the host's promise. The only thing that seemed slightly odd was the single antique rocking chair placed directly in front of the large window. It faced outward, as if waiting for someone to sit and watch the forest. After unpacking, I decided to explore the cabin. There was a small kitchen, a lofted bedroom, and a basement that was locked with a sign reading, "Private, do not enter." I wasn't about to break any rules, so I ignored it and headed back upstairs. The evening passed peacefully. I made myself some tea, read a book by the fire, and finally settled into bed early, hoping to recharge. Around midnight, I was woken by a sound, a slow, rhythmic creaking. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, it became clear. It was the sound of the rocking chair moving back and forth. My heart raced as I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear more. The sound stopped abruptly. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just the old wood of the cabin settling, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The rocking chair, which had been facing the forest when I arrived, was now turned slightly toward the living room. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had bumped it the night before, though I couldn't recall going near it. The rest of the day was uneventful. I spent most of it outside, enjoying the snow and taking photographs of the beautiful scenery. That night, as I was preparing for bed, I heard the creaking again. This time I was wide awake. I slowly walked down the stairs and peeked into the living room. The chair was moving, rocking gently back and forth on its own. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was dimly lit. I stared at the chair, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe there was a draft, or maybe the floor was uneven. Summoning my courage, I approached the chair and placed my hand on it to stop its motion. It stilled under my touch, and for a moment I felt silly for being scared. Then, as I turned to head back upstairs, I felt it, a faint but cold breeze brushing past me, even though all the windows and doors were shut tight. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The chair remained motionless. Telling myself I was just imagining things, I went back to bed, though it took me hours to fall asleep. The final night was when everything escalated. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch when I heard a distinct knock, 3 sharp raps on the locked basement door. My blood ran cold. The knock came again, louder this time. Trembling, I grabbed my phone and texted the Airbnb host, asking if anyone else had access to the property. He replied almost immediately, "No one else should be there. I'll call the police." As I read his message, the basement door handle jiggled violently, as though someone was trying to force it open. I grabbed the fireplace poker, backing away toward the front door. My mind raced. Should I run out into the freezing night, or stay and face whatever was trying to get out of the basement? Before I could decide, the door burst open with a deafening crack. My breath caught as I stared into the darkness beyond. But there was no one there. Just an empty, cold stone staircase leading down into the shadows. That was all I needed. I bolted out of the cabin, leaving everything behind except my keys and phone. I jumped into my car and drove through the snowy roads without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I spent the night in a motel. The next day, I got a message from the host apologizing profusely. He said the police had found the basement empty but noticed strange markings on the walls, almost like claw marks. He assured me he would investigate further, but I never responded. I didn't want to know. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that cabin. All I know is that I'll never stay in an isolated Airbnb again. It was Christmas Eve, 2022, and I had volunteered to house sit for a family friend. The house was a grand Victorian mansion on the edge of town, surrounded by a dense forest that was now blanketed in snow. The family who owned it had left for the holidays, and I thought spending a quiet Christmas alone in such a beautiful house would be a peaceful break from my hectic life. The house was lavishly decorated for the holidays. A towering Christmas tree stood in the foyer. Garlands adorned the banisters, and the smell of cinnamon candles filled the air. Despite its charm, the house had an eerie stillness to it, especially with no one else around. I brushed off the feeling as nerves and settled in with a cup of cocoa and a book. By 9 p.m., snow had started falling heavily outside, and the wind howled through the trees. I was curled up on the couch in the living room when I heard the faint sound of bells jingling. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was coming from within the house. Curious, I set my mug down and followed the sound, which seemed to grow louder as I moved toward the dining room. When I entered, I froze. Sitting at the center of the large dining table was a small, intricately wrapped gift box with a bright red bow. I hadn't seen it there earlier, and I was certain no one else was in the house. My heart began to race. Hesitantly, I approached the box and picked it up. A tag dangled from the ribbon, and in elegant handwriting, it read, "For you." My stomach churned. Who had left this here, and why? Before I could think further, the bells jingled again, this time louder and closer, as if they were right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The only sound was the crackling of the fireplace in the living room. Trying to calm myself, I opened the gift box. Inside was a single, old-fashioned brass key. It was heavy and cold to the touch, and I had no idea what it could unlock. As I stood there, confused, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor of the master bedroom. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I grabbed my phone and the fireplace poker, my heart pounding, and made my way upstairs. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas tree in the foyer below. The footsteps had stopped. I reached the master bedroom and pushed the door open, holding my breath. The room was empty, but the large window was wide open, letting in the freezing winter air. Snowflakes swirled into the room, landing on the polished wooden floor. I hurried to close it, but as I did, I noticed something odd in the snow just outside the window. A trail of footprints leading away from the house and disappearing into the woods. I told myself it was probably just an animal, though deep down, I didn't believe it. Shaken, I returned downstairs, locking every door and window I could find. I considered leaving the house altogether, but the snowstorm outside was now raging, making the roads impassable. Just as I began to relax, the bells jingled again. This time, they were accompanied by a faint, melodic humming. The sound was coming from the living room. Gathering my courage, I crept toward the sound, clutching the poker tightly. The sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. Standing in front of the Christmas tree was a figure dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned Santa suit. His back was turned to me, but he was holding something in his gloved hand, a long, rusted chain that jingled as it moved. His humming grew louder, and then, without turning around, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "You've been waiting for your gift." I stumbled backward, knocking over a side table. The sound startled him, and he turned to face me. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly red. A chilling smile spread across his cracked lips as he began to move toward me, dragging the chain behind him. Panicking, I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock. Just as I managed to get it open, the wind slammed it shut with a force that knocked me to the ground. I scrambled to my feet and turned to see the figure standing just a few feet away, his chains now slithering like snakes across the floor toward me. Desperate, I pulled the brass key from my pocket, though I had no idea what to do with it. As soon as I gripped it tightly, the jingling bells and humming stopped. The figure froze, his smile fading. He let out a guttural growl and lunged at me, but before he could reach me, the key began to glow with a blinding golden light. The next thing I knew, I was outside, lying in the snow. The house stood silent and dark behind me, as if no one had ever been inside. I didn't wait to find out what had happened. I ran to my car and didn't look back. Later, when I told the family what had happened, they seemed hesitant to believe me. However, the husband eventually admitted that they had found the brass key years ago in the attic, but had never been able to figure out what it unlocked. They had left it in the house, thinking it was harmless. To this day, I'll never forget the sound of those jingling bells or the sight of that eerie Santa. Christmas has never felt the same since.